Buddha times Freud / Jung. What is the ego, really? The paradox. Freud said the ego is what keeps you sane. Strengthen it. The Buddha said the ego is what keeps you suffering. See through it. One of them has to be wrong. Unless the word ego doesn't mean what you think it means. Today, 3 of history's deepest explorers of the human mind, Freud, Jung, and the Buddha, each drew a map of the same territory, that thing inside you that says I. Freud's map says, protect it. Jung's map says, it's not the whole picture. The Buddha's map says, look closer and watch what happens. By the end of this video, you won't just understand these 3 maps. You'll know which one you need and why this channel is called what it's called. But first, a confession. We've been using the word ego as if everyone agrees on what it means. They don't, not even close. And the confusion started with a translation error, one that changed how the entire English-speaking world thinks about the mind. Here's what I mean. When Freud sat in his study in Vienna and wrote about the mind, he didn't use the word ego. He used a much simpler word, a word every German child knows. He wrote das Ich. The I, that's it, the most intimate word in any language. The word you use before you use any other word. I am hungry, I am afraid, I am. And when his work was translated into English by a man named James Strachey, das Ich became the ego, a Latin clinical term, cold, technical, something that sounds like it belongs in a textbook, not in your chest. The psychoanalyst Bruno Bettelheim spent years arguing this was a catastrophe. His point was sharp. Freud chose a word that makes us feel alive. The translation handed us a term from a dead language. And that single shift from the I to the ego changed everything. It turned an intimate exploration of your inner life into what sounds like a medical diagnosis. When someone says you have a big ego, it sounds like a disease. When Freud said das Ich is struggling, he meant you are struggling, the most personal part of you. Keep that in mind. Because when we get to the Buddha later, this translation problem will matter even more than you think. So let's start where modern psychology started. Let's start with Freud's map. Freud's map. Freud's world Vienna. Turn of the 20th century. A city of coffee houses and contradictions. Waltzes on the surface, neurosis underneath. And in a consulting room at Berggasse 19, a doctor is listening to people talk about their dreams, their slips of the tongue, their inexplicable fears. And he's building something no one has built before. A map of the inside. Now, Freud gets a lot of things thrown at him, some deserved. But here's what's easy to forget. Before Freud, the Western world didn't really have a working model of the unconscious mind. Philosophy talked about reason. Medicine talked about the brain. Freud said, there's a whole world inside you that you can't see, and it's running the show. And the map he drew of that world has 3 regions. Id, ego, superego. First, das Es, the it, translated into English as the id. The ID is the oldest part of you, the raw material. Freud called it a cauldron of seething excitations. No logic, no morality, no sense of time. It wants what it wants, and it wants it now. Hunger, desire, rage. The id doesn't negotiate. Second, das Überich, the over-I, translated as the superego. The superego is the voice of every rule you've internalized. Your parents, your culture, your religion. The should machine. Freud had an image for this, and it's not gentle, He called the superego a garrison in a conquered city, not a friendly guide, an occupying force. And then, caught between the cauldron and the garrison, das Ich, the I, the ego. Here's where most people get Freud wrong. In popular culture, ego means arrogance, selfishness, the thing spiritual teachers tell you to dissolve. But for Freud, the ego is not the villain of the story. The ego is the most overworked, underpaid part of your psyche. The ego is the mediator, the negotiator, the one trying to keep you functional while the id screams, I want, and the superego screams, you shouldn't. The ego is the part that says, okay, let's find a way to get through this Tuesday. Freud had a metaphor he loved. The ego, he said, is like a man on horseback who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse. The horse is the id, massive, powerful. The rider, the ego, is smaller, weaker. But the rider chooses the direction, most of the time. And sometimes the rider can only steer where the horse was already going and pretend it was his idea. That image should make you feel something, not contempt for the ego, sympathy. Freud himself put it plainly. The poor ego serves three severe masters, the external world, the superego, and the id, and does its best to reconcile their demands. When it fails, you get anxiety. When it really fails, you get neurosis. Where it was, there shall I become. So what was Freud's solution? What was the whole point of psychoanalysis? One sentence, maybe the most famous sentence in the history of psychology, from his new introductory lectures, 1933, not his earlier work, though it's often misplaced. Wo es war, soll ich werden. Where it was, there shall I become. Or, in the clinical translation, where it was, their ego shall be. Read that again. Freud's entire project, years of talking cures, dream analysis, free association, boils down to this: expand the territory of the I. Take what was unconscious and make it conscious. Take what was driving you blindly and bring it into the light so you, das Ich, can choose. The goal of Freudian therapy is not to kill the ego. It's to make the ego stronger, more capable, more aware, to give the rider better reins. And this matters because when we get to the Buddha, we'll see an approach that looks like the exact opposite. Freud says, strengthen the I. The Buddha says, investigate whether the I is what you think it is. Same territory, opposite directions, or so it seems. The man behind the map, but before we leave Freud's map, the man himself, because you can't separate the map from the mapmaker. Sigmund Freud, born in Moravia, raised in Vienna, Jewish, proudly secular. He smoked roughly 20 cigars a day. And yes, someone once asked him whether the cigar was a symbol. The famous reply, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, probably never said it. It appears in no verified source, which is itself a Freudian irony. We want Freud to have said it, so we made it true. What is true? By 1923, the same year he published The Ego and the AED, Freud was diagnosed with cancer of the jaw. Over the next 16 years, he underwent approximately 33 operations. He wore a prosthesis he privately called the monster. He kept working. He kept writing. He kept seeing patients through pain that would have stopped most people long before. In 1938, the Nazis annexed Austria. Freud was 82. He escaped to London. 4 of his sisters did not escape. They died in concentration camps. And in September 1939, in a house in Hampstead, Freud turned to his physician, Max Schur, and said, his last recorded words, "Now it is nothing but torture and makes no sense. Then Schur administered morphine, and Freud died. Peacefully, in the end. I tell you this not as trivia. I tell you because the man who built the map of the ego, the map that says, strengthen the I, expand its territory, make it the rider and not the horse. That man knew suffering in a way that would have broken most egos entirely. And he still believed the answer is more consciousness, not less. Hold that. Because the Buddha will offer a different relationship to suffering. But Freud earned his answer. It wasn't theory, it was lived. Ego psychology and descendants. Now to you, Freud died, but his map didn't. After him came a school called ego psychology. His daughter Anna Freud mapped the defense mechanisms, the ways the ego protects itself. Denial, projection, rationalization. You probably recognize these. You probably use at least 2 of them today. Then Heinz Hartmann proposed something Freud himself never quite got to. That the ego isn't only managing conflict. There's a conflict-free sphere. Parts of the ego that develop on their own. Learning, planning, creating. The ego isn't just a firefighter, it's also a builder. Then Erik Erikson, identity crisis, a phrase he coined, extended the ego's story across an entire lifespan. The ego doesn't just mediate between ID and superego in a consulting room. It develops. It faces different challenges at different ages. At 20, the challenge is identity. At 60, and this might feel relevant, the challenge is what Erikson called integrity versus despair. Looking back at your life and finding it either whole or wasted. And here's something that might surprise you. The modern therapies most people actually use, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, are, in a real sense, grandchildren of Freud's ego-strengthening project. They don't use his language. They might not even acknowledge the debt, but the core idea is the same. Make the conscious mind stronger. Give it better tools. Expand the rider's control. Marsha Linehan, who created DBT, said it directly. The skills are psychological and behavioral versions of meditation practices from Eastern spiritual training, which means the line from Freud to Buddhism isn't as long as you'd think. Even within Western therapy, the 2 traditions are already reaching toward each other. Oceanic feeling. Freud glimpsed something. And there's one more thing. One moment where Freud came closer to the Buddha than he ever admitted. In 1930, he published Civilization and Its Discontents. In the opening pages, he describes a letter from his friend Romain Rolland, the French writer, who told Freud about a feeling, a sensation of something limitless, boundless, a feeling of connection with the whole universe. Rolland called it the oceanic feeling and said it was the true source of religious experience. Freud took it seriously. He didn't dismiss it. In fact, he offered an explanation that's remarkably close to something a Buddhist might recognize. Originally, Freud wrote, the ego includes everything. The infant doesn't distinguish self from world. Later, it learns to separate, to draw a boundary. The ego feeling we have now, he said, is only a shrunken vestige of a far more extensive feeling. Read that carefully. Freud is saying, the sense of being a separate self, the very ego he spent his life mapping, is constructed, narrowed, a smaller version of something that was once borderless. He saw the construction. He recognized the boundary as artificial, and then he turned away. Because for Freud, the dissolution of that boundary wasn't liberation. It was regression, going backward, returning to the infant state. The goal was to strengthen the boundary, not dissolve it. The Buddha, as we'll see, looked at the same constructed boundary and walked through it, but that comes later. For now, notice what Freud gave us. A map that says, the I is real, it's overworked, it's fragile, and the best thing you can do is make it stronger, more conscious, more capable of holding the reins. It's a dignified map, a compassionate one even. And for many people, maybe for you, it's exactly the right map. But there was someone who looked at Freud's map and said, it's not wrong, it's just not big enough. The ego exists, yes, but it's not the whole story. There's something larger, something underneath, something Freud refused to see, because seeing it cost this man the most important friendship of his life. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. Jung's map, the break. The year was 1907. The place, Freud's apartment in Vienna. A young Swiss psychiatrist had written to Freud, sent him a book, and been invited to visit. They sat down and started talking. 13 hours, not an exaggeration, not a metaphor. They talked for 13 consecutive hours. Freud, who was already the most famous psychologist alive, later called Jung his crown prince, the heir who would carry psychoanalysis into the future. It lasted about 6 years. The break, when it came, was ugly, the way only intellectual breakups can be. Slow, personal, wrapped in theoretical language that barely concealed the wound underneath. Jung wrote a book that reimagined libido as something broader than sexual energy. Freud felt betrayed, letters turned cold, meetings turned tense, and there were 2 incidents that Jung never forgot. In Bremen, 1909, Freud fainted in Jung's presence. Then again in Munich, 1912. Freud himself thought it had to do with Jung's growing independence, as if his body couldn't tolerate the separation his mind hadn't yet accepted. Jung later wrote, simply, "It cost me Freud's friendship. They never spoke again." Why does this matter for our story? Because the break wasn't just personal, it was cartographic. Jung looked at Freud's map, id, ego, superego, and said, "You've mapped one floor of a building that has basements you refuse to enter. The ego isn't just a mediator between the ID and the superego. The ego is a small, bright room in a very, very large house, and most of the house is dark." Ego versus self, the small circle. Here is Jung's central move, and it's the move that changes everything. Freud said, "The ego is the main character, strengthen it." Jung said, "The ego is not the main character, it only thinks it is." Jung drew a diagram. Imagine a large circle. This is what he called the self, capital S. The self, he wrote, is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. Everything you know about yourself, everything you don't know, everything you refuse to know, the self holds it all. Now inside that large circle, draw a small circle, a bright dot near the top. That's the ego, the conscious mind. The part of you that says I and thinks it's running the show. The part that makes plans and checks email and introduces itself at parties. The ego, for Jung, is real, functional, necessary. But it's a flashlight in a cathedral. It illuminates whatever it points at and mistakes the lit area for the whole room. Freud's project was make the flashlight brighter. Jung's project was realize how big the cathedral is. He called this process individuation, not the destruction of the ego. Jung was very clear about that. The ego doesn't disappear, it relocates. It moves from the center of the psyche to its proper place, a conscious point within a much larger whole, like a ship that's been sailing in circles because it thought it was the ocean. Individuation is the moment the ship discovers you are on the ocean. You are not the ocean itself. If something about that sounds Buddhist to you, hold that thought. Jung heard it too, and he both embraced it and ran from it. The shadow. But before individuation can happen, you have to meet what's in the dark. Jung called it the shadow. Everyone carries a shadow, he wrote in 1938, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The shadow is everything about you that you've pushed out of the light, not just bad things, though yes, rage, jealousy, cruelty live there, but also unlived potential. Creativity, you were told, wasn't practical. Tenderness, you were told, wasn't masculine. Wildness, you were told, wasn't appropriate. The shadow holds what the ego refused, and here, a correction that matters. You've probably seen this quote attributed to Jung. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. It's everywhere. Posters, Instagram, tattoos, probably. Jung never said it, not in those words. What he actually wrote, in Ion, is stronger, more precise, and more unsettling. When an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. Read the difference. The popular version says, your unconscious directs your life. That's internal, almost manageable. The real version says, what you refuse to face doesn't stay inside. It manifests in the world. It becomes the partner you keep choosing, the argument you keep having, the pattern you can't explain. For Jung, the shadow isn't just a concept, it's a force. And ignoring it doesn't make it passive. It makes it creative in ways you didn't authorize. Now, notice the parallel. We'll get to it fully in Act 3, but notice. The Buddha also talked about dark material in the mind. 3 root poisons: greed, hatred, delusion. What he called kilesas. He compared them to parasitic vines smothering a tree. 3 thinkers. 3 encounters with the darkness inside. Freud said, manage it. The ego must hold the id's reins. Jung said, integrate it. Turn toward the shadow. Make it conscious. Because what you integrate becomes your ally. What you exile becomes your fate. And the Buddha said something different from both. But we're not there yet. Jung and Buddhism. The door. He opened and wouldn't walk through. Here's where Jung's story gets interesting for us. He was fascinated by Buddhism, genuinely, deeply fascinated. He wrote the foreword to D.T. Suzuki's Introduction to Zen Buddhism, calling it among the best contributions to knowledge of living Buddhism. He wrote a commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He studied The Secret of the Golden Flower, a Chinese meditation text, and called it an unsuspected confirmation concerning the mandala. Jung saw something in Buddhist psychology that matched what he was finding in his patients' dreams, in their paintings, in the symbols rising unbidden from the unconscious. Mandala after mandala, circles within circles. The self expressing itself through imagery that looked remarkably like Tibetan thangkas, painted by Swiss accountants who had never seen one. And in his foreword to Suzuki, Jung came tantalizingly close to the Buddha's territory. He described the self as experienced, not conceptually, but experientially, as what he called Nichi-ich, non-ego. A state where the ego recognizes itself as not the center, not the whole, not the final word, non-ego. Coming from Jung, that's extraordinary. That's a Freudian heresy of the highest order. And yet, Jung pulled back. he pulled back hard. He warned explicitly and repeatedly against Westerners imitating Eastern practice. "We have let the house our fathers built fall into decay," he said, "and now we try to break into Oriental palaces that our fathers never knew." His concern wasn't that Buddhism was wrong. His concern was that Westerners would use it to bypass their own shadow work, to leap to transcendence without first becoming a whole person. And on one fundamental point, Jung drew a line he would never cross. Consciousness, he insisted, requires a subject. There must be somebody who is aware. You can't dissolve the experiencer and still have experience. The self transcends the ego, yes, but the self is still someone, still an entity, still an archetype with a center. The Buddha, as we'll see, disagreed, not about the experience, but about the necessity of a somebody having it. This is the paradox of Jung's position. Of the three map makers, he came closest to the Buddha's territory. He saw that the ego was not the whole. He saw that the unconscious held wisdom, not just pathology. He even glimpsed non-ego, but he stopped at the threshold. Because for Jung, to cross it would mean losing the very ground of consciousness itself. Jung opened a door that Buddhism had already walked through, and then, thoughtfully, deliberately, for reasons he believed were vital, he chose not to follow. The builder, the man himself, Carl Gustav Jung. Born in Switzerland, son of a Protestant pastor who had lost his faith, a detail Jung carried his entire life. The father who was supposed to have answers and didn't. After the break with Freud, Jung entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. For 16 years, 1914 to 1930, he recorded his visions, his dialogues with inner figures, his mandalas, in a massive red leather book, the Red Book, Liber Novus. It wasn't published until 2009, nearly 50 years after his death. When it appeared, it stunned the psychological world. It read less like science and more like scripture. And at Bollingen, on the shore of Lake Zurich, Jung built a tower, by hand, stone by stone. No electricity, no running water, initially. He said the tower represented the psyche, built slowly, layer by layer, each room a different dimension of the self. He cooked over a fire. He carved inscriptions into the walls. He lived there, intermittently, for decades. There's something in that image, the man who mapped the entire interior of the psyche, building an actual stone structure with his actual hands, that tells you everything about Jung's relationship to the unconscious. He didn't just theorize about it, he lived in it. He let it change him. He let it break him and rebuild him. And he called Buddhism the most sensible and most direct of all religions. But he would not become a Buddhist, because his map said, the self is larger than the ego, yes, but it is still yourself, still has a center, still has a someone. Two maps now. Freud's map says, the ego is the rider, the horse is wild, your job is to ride better. Jung's map says, the rider is not alone. There's a whole landscape, forests, shadows, depths, that the rider has never explored. Your job is to discover the territory you're actually in. Both maps agree on one thing. There is a rider. And now, 2,500 years before Vienna and Zurich, a man sitting under a tree in northern India looked at the rider, looked carefully, looked with a precision that took decades of practice, and couldn't find one. Buddha's map, a different kind of map. Now, a shift. With Freud, we had a consulting room, a couch, a doctor listening. With Jung, we had a stone tower, a red book, a man descending into his own depths. With the Buddha, we have something else entirely. Not a theory of the mind built from observing patience, not a symbolic system built from dreams and myths, but a direct investigation, first person, rigorous, repeated, into what happens when you look for the one who's looking. And the first thing the Buddha did was something that would have made both Freud and Jung nod in recognition. He took the self apart. 5 aggregates, Buddha's psychology. In his second discourse, delivered to 5 ascetics in a deer park weeks after his awakening, the Buddha laid out what you might call his psychology. Not id, ego, superego, not ego, shadow, self, but 5 aggregates, 5 khandhas, form, the body, the physical, feeling, not emotion, but the raw tone of experience, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. The first filter, everything passes through. Perception, recognition, the mind labeling. This is a chair, this is a threat, this is my mother's voice. Mental formations, intentions, reactions, habits, the whole engine of volition. This is where decisions happen, where karma is made, and consciousness, awareness of any of the above. Not a thing that has experience, but the arising of experience itself. 5 processes. Not 5 parts of a machine, 5 currents of a river, constantly moving, constantly changing. And here is the key. None of them is you. The Buddha's logic was precise, almost surgical. Listen to how he argued it. If form were the self, form would not lend itself to dis-ease. It would be possible to say, let my form be thus, let my form not be thus. Simple, devastating. If the ego were truly yours, the way your hand is yours, you could control it. You could say, stop being anxious, stop being angry, stop being sad. Let my ego be thus. You can't. You've tried. You know you can't. Therefore, the Buddha concluded, it's not yours, not in the way you think it is. Notice, he didn't say it doesn't exist. He said it doesn't belong to you the way you assume. This is not a statement about metaphysics. It's a statement about ownership, and that distinction changes everything. The wrong question now. Here's where the Buddha parts company with both Freud and Jung in a way that might genuinely shock you. In the Sabbasava Sutta, the Buddha lists a series of questions. Questions that sound reasonable. Questions that sound, in fact, like the entire starting point of Western psychology. Am I? What am I? How am I? Where did this being come from? Where is it going? Sound familiar? These are, almost word for word, the questions psychoanalysis was built to answer. Freud's patients lay on couches asking, what am I really? What's driving me? Where did this pattern come from? Jung's patients painted mandalas asking, who am I beneath the persona? What is my true self? The Buddha called these questions a thicket of views, a tangle, not wrong in the way that 2 + 2 = 5 is wrong, but wrong in the way that asking, what color is jealousy, is wrong. The question assumes a framework that doesn't lead where you need to go. For the Buddha, the question isn't, what am I? The question is, does this cause suffering? Can I let it go? Not, who is the rider? But, does clinging to the idea of a rider cause pain? Freud built a cathedral of answers to what am I? Jung built an even larger one. The Buddha looked at the question itself and set it down. 3 responses to the same question. And there's a moment in the texts that illustrates this more vividly than any argument could. A wanderer named Vacchagotta came to the Buddha and asked directly, is there a self? The Buddha said nothing. Vacchagotta tried again. Then is there no self? Silence. Vacchagotta got up and left. Afterward, Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, asked, "Why didn't you answer?" And the Buddha explained, "If I'd said there is a self, I'd have been siding with those who cling to permanence. If I'd said there is no self, I'd have been siding with those who cling to annihilation. Either answer would have trapped Vacchagotta in a view." Silence was the most compassionate response. Now, imagine Freud in that seat. Someone asks, "Is there a self?" Freud answers immediately, "Of course there is. The ego exists, it mediates, it struggles, it can be strengthened." Next question. Imagine Jung in that seat. Someone asks, "Is there a self?" Jung answers, "Yes, but not the self you think. The ego is real, but partial. There's a larger self, capital S, that encompasses everything. Let me tell you about individuation." The Buddha. Silence. 3 thinkers. 3 responses to the same question. One says, "Yes," and strengthen it. One says, "Yes, but it's bigger than you think." One refuses the frame entirely. Not existence, but relationship. And here is where most people, including many Buddhists, get confused. So, let me be precise. The Buddha did not teach that the ego doesn't exist. Thanisaro Bhikkhu, one of the most respected translators of the Pali Canon, has spent decades clarifying this point. Anatta, he argues, is not a doctrine of no self. It is a not-self strategy. Both self and not-self, he writes, are strategies, not metaphysical tenets. Read that again. Strategies, tools, not truth claims about ultimate reality, but practices you pick up when they're useful and set down when they're not. And this reframing dissolves what seemed like an impossible contradiction between Freud and the Buddha. They don't disagree about whether the ego exists. They disagree about your relationship to it. Freud says, identify with it, strengthen it, make it the master of the house. The Buddha says, use it, but don't mistake it for who you are. Thanisaro put this with startling clarity in an essay where he directly mapped the Western models onto the Buddhist one. Freud, he wrote, described the ego's constant need to negotiate among the shoulds of the superego, the wants of the ID, and the demands of reality. Jung saw the clash between the individual ego and the larger unconscious. The Buddha saw all of this and called it dukkha, stress, suffering, the inherent strain of constructing and maintaining a self. Not because the construction is evil, because it's exhausting, and because there's an alternative. The scent that lingers. And now, the most beautiful text we'll encounter today, one that shows just how subtle the Buddha's map really is. A monk named Khemaka was sick, seriously ill, and the elders sent a message asking, do you still identify with the 5 aggregates? Are you still clinging to a sense of self? Khemaka's answer is one of the most psychologically honest statements in all of religious literature. He said, with regard to the 5 aggregates, there is nothing I assume to be self. And yet, I am has not been overcome. Although I don't assume that I am this body, I am this feeling, I am this thought, still, a bare sense of I am lingers. Do you feel the precision of that? He's not clinging to any specific identity. He doesn't think he's his body, his emotions, his ideas. But the raw sense of being someone, the bare I am, hasn't dissolved yet. And to explain this, Khemaka reached for 2 images that have stayed with me since I first read them. The first, a lotus, a blue, red, or white lotus. The scent of that flower is not the scent of the petals, not the scent of the color, not the scent of the filament. The scent pervades the whole flower, but belongs to no single part. That's how I am pervades the aggregates. You can't point to any one component and say, there. That's where the self lives. It's everywhere and nowhere. Like a fragrance you can't locate. Freud would recognize this. He spent his career trying to locate the ego and kept finding it diffused across functions, defenses, compromises. Jung would recognize it too. The self as something that can't be reduced to any single archetype. But Khemaka's second image goes somewhere neither Freud nor Jung went. A cloth that has been washed, clean. But it still carries the faint scent of the salt, the lye, the cow dung that was used to clean it. Put it in a scent-infused hamper, and eventually that lingering smell is fully obliterated. The I am that lingers even after deep insight. It's not a failure, it's a residue, and with continued practice, not more analysis, not more integration, but continued clear seeing, even that residue fades. The sutta ends with a quiet miracle. As Khemaka explained this, 60-some monks, and Khemaka himself, attained full awakening. The explanation was the practice. The seeing was the release. Ego as raft, ego as verb. And here we arrive at the insight that ties all three maps together. The Buddha didn't say, destroy the ego. He didn't say, the ego is your enemy. In fact, there's a striking verse in the Dhammapada. Your own self is your own mainstay. And in the Ahaṅkāra Nikaya, a line that sounds almost paradoxical. By relying on conceit, conceit is to be abandoned. Using the ego to go beyond the ego. Using the raft to cross the river. And then, only then, setting it down. Not burning it on the near shore. Not carrying it on your back forever. Using it fully. And then, letting go. Now, do you remember the translation problem from the beginning? How Freud wrote das Ich, the I, and English turned it into the ego. A living word became a clinical artifact. Something intimate became something foreign. The Buddha had a word too. Actually, two words. Ahaṅkāra, I-making. Ahaṅkāra, my-making. Not the ego, not the self, not a thing inside you, a doing, a verb, an activity that the mind performs moment by moment, constructing a sense of I and mine, the way a spider spins a web. The web is real. You can see it. You can touch it. But it's not a thing the spider has. It's a thing the spider does. Thanissaro translates the Buddha's insight this way. He points to the act of creating a sense of self-identity, I-making and my-making, as a major cause of stress. And here is where the three maps finally reveal their deepest difference. Not a difference of opinion about what the ego is. A difference in grammar. Freud made the ego a noun, das Ich, the I, a structure, an entity, something you have. Jung made the ego a smaller noun inside a bigger noun, the ego within the self, still a thing, still an entity, a smaller circle inside a larger one. The Buddha made the ego a verb, not something you have, something you do, not a rider on a horse, not a flashlight in a cathedral, but an activity, a constructing, a making. You don't have an ego, you do ego. And if it's something you do, then it's something you can, with practice, with clarity, with patience. Stop doing. Not violently, not by killing anything. The way you stop clenching a fist, you just open. Freud tells you to strengthen the doer. Jung tells you to widen the doing. The Buddha says, see the doing clearly, and when you're ready, stop. 3 maps, 1 territory. 3 maps. A consulting room in Vienna where a dying man taught the world that the I is real, fragile, and worth strengthening. A stone tower by a Swiss lake, where a builder taught the world that the I is not the whole, that beneath it lie shadows and depths and a self larger than the ego dares imagine. A tree in northern India, where a man who had once been a prince taught the world that the I is not a thing but a doing, and that seeing this clearly is the beginning of freedom. They're not enemies, they're not even competitors, they're different altitudes on the same mountain. Where are you? And here's the practical part. Because ideas that don't touch your life are just decoration. Where are you? If your ego is fractured, if the rider keeps falling off the horse, if anxiety and compulsion are running the show, if you can't hold a coherent sense of I long enough to function, Freud is your guide. Strengthen the ego. Build the rider. There is no shame in this. It's not less spiritual. It's foundational. The Buddha himself said, "Your own self is your own mainstay." You need a self before you can investigate it. If your ego is stable, but you sense there's more, shadow material you've never faced, potential you've never claimed, a feeling that you're living as a fraction of who you actually are. Jung is your guide. Turn toward the darkness. Integrate what you've exiled. Discover the cathedral you've been standing in without knowing. And if you've built the ego, if you've integrated the shadow, if the house is whole, and you still feel a question, a subtle sense that the I who did all this building and integrating is itself something worth investigating, not destroying, investigating, with the same honesty you brought to everything else, then the Buddha is your guide, not because his map is higher or better, because it goes to a place the other two didn't map. The territory beyond the map maker, the space that opens when the I that's been doing all the making rests. They need each other. And here's what I think none of them would say, but all of them might agree with if you caught them in the right moment. They need each other. Buddhism without psychological grounding can become spiritual bypass, the leap to no self before you've built a self-worth examining. Jung warned about exactly this, and he was right. You can't transcend what you haven't first inhabited. Psychology without the Buddha's question can become an endless renovation project, always strengthening, always integrating, never asking whether the contractor is as solid as he assumes. The healthiest path might not be choosing one map. It might be knowing all three, and knowing which one to reach for when. Ego. One more thing. This channel is called Ego. Not because the ego is the enemy. We've spent 46 minutes with 3 men who devoted their lives to this territory, and not one of them said the ego was the enemy. It's called ego because the ego is the territory we're all exploring. Every one of us, every day, is doing this thing, this I-making, this constructing a sense of self. And most of the time, we don't even notice. Freud noticed. He called it the I and said, make it stronger. Jung noticed. He called it a small circle and said, there's a larger one. The Buddha noticed. He called it I-making and said, see it clearly, all the way through. The map you need depends on where you are and where you're trying to go. But the territory, that's the same for all of us. That quiet, persistent, sometimes painful, sometimes beautiful activity of saying, I